The night my father handed his company to my younger brother, everyone stood and applauded like they were witnessing history. Don't miss out on the journey, subscribe and let's grow, laugh, and learn together. I sat near the back of the ballroom, smiling just enough to avoid questions while Daniel shook hands beside Dad under the bright stage lights. This company deserves strong leadership, my father announced proudly. And Daniel is the future of this family. The room erupted again. I felt dozens of eyes glance toward me for half a second before quickly looking away. 20 years inside that company, and somehow I had become invisible in a single sentence. My brother leaned close as the cameras flashed around us. Don't take it personally, he whispered with a grin. Dad said you were never leadership material. I nodded calmly, but my chest burned so hard I could barely breathe. Because what nobody in that room knew was that 3 months earlier, I had uncovered financial records buried deep inside our internal accounts, fake vendors, missing funds, and signatures that led directly back to Daniel. I brought the evidence to my father privately, expecting shock, maybe even gratitude. Instead, he closed the folder, slid it back across his desk, and told me something I'll never forget. Some truths are expensive, he said quietly. Family comes first. That was the moment I realized he wasn't protecting the company. He was protecting my brother. So while everyone raised their glasses that night, celebrating the new CEO, my phone vibrated silently inside my pocket with an email notification I had been waiting weeks to receive. The subject line only contained 6 words: "The SEC has officially opened investigation." By the end of the week, the company looked nothing like the empire my father once controlled with absolute confidence. News outlets were circling the story. Investors demanded emergency meetings. Senior executives who used to praise Daniel publicly were suddenly hiring personal attorneys and pretending they barely knew him. The same people who toasted his promotion 3 nights earlier now avoided his calls completely. Fear spreads faster than loyalty when money is involved. I watched everything unfold quietly from my apartment while federal investigators moved through the company floor by floor collecting records. Every hour brought another headline, another rumor, another crack in the image my father spent decades building. Then, early Friday morning, my phone rang again. Dad. I almost didn't answer. But something in me needed to hear his voice now that control was slipping from his hands. He sounded exhausted the second I picked up. The board wants me to resign, he said without greeting. No anger this time. No authority. Just damage. I stayed silent. Daniel is blaming accounting, he continued bitterly. Accounting is blaming legal. Legal says investigators already have enough evidence for criminal referrals. I leaned back slowly in my chair, staring out the window at the rain sliding down the glass. You should have listened when I warned you. He exhaled sharply. You think I don't know that now? That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Because my father never admitted mistakes. Not to employees. Not to family. Not to himself. Growing up, he taught us that weakness invited destruction. Apologies were for people without leverage. But now the leverage was gone. Why him? I asked quietly after a long silence. After everything he did, why did you always choose him? Dad didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. Because he needed me less when you carried the weight. I closed my eyes for a second. That was it. The entire truth of our family reduced to one sentence. Daniel was protected because I was dependable enough to survive without protection. Every unfair decision suddenly made perfect sense. Every sacrifice. Every dismissal. Every time Dad handed my work to my brother and expected me to stay quiet afterward. I was never overlooked by accident. I was simply convenient. You made me responsible for everyone, I said softly, and called it loyalty. He didn't deny it. In the background, I could hear muffled voices and movement, probably lawyers surrounding him inside some conference room trying to contain a disaster already too large to hide. There may still be a settlement, he muttered carefully. If you cooperate privately, I already cooperated, I interrupted calmly. Just not with you. Silence. Heavy and final. Then his voice dropped lower. Do you hate us that much? I looked around my quiet apartment, thinking about how many years I spent trying to earn love that always came with conditions attached. Success without recognition. Loyalty without protection. Silence without respect. No, I answered honestly. That's the problem. I loved this family enough to tell the truth before strangers had to. He stopped speaking after that. For several seconds all I heard was breathing on the other end of the line. Then finally, quietly, almost like he was speaking to himself instead of me, he said, "I thought keeping the company in the family mattered more than anything." I stared out at the rain again before answering. "And now you might lose both." He hung up without another word. Later that night, financial authorities officially froze multiple executive accounts connected to the investigation. Daniel's name was everywhere online by morning. Analysts called it corporate fraud. Reporters called it corruption. But sitting alone in my apartment with the city lights glowing outside my window, I called it something much simpler. Consequences. And somewhere across town, inside a collapsing empire built on silence and favoritism, my father was finally learning that protecting one son had cost him the other. 6 months later, the company no longer belonged to my family. The board forced my father into retirement, Daniel accepted a federal plea deal, and the empire they protected for decades was broken apart and sold in pieces to keep investors from losing everything. Reporters still called sometimes, hoping I would publicly destroy them with some dramatic interview, but I never did. I had spent enough years living inside chaos. I wasn't interested in building a future around revenge too. I moved into a smaller apartment near the water, started consulting independently, and for the first time in my adult life, my phone stayed quiet at night. No emergencies. No cleanup. No family pressure disguised as loyalty. Just peace. Dad tried reaching out twice after the hearings ended. The second message was shorter than the first. "I should have listened to you." I read it once and never replied. Not because I hated him. And not because I wanted punishment. Some damage simply changes the shape of a relationship forever. You can understand someone and still never trust them again. That was the lesson he learned too late. One evening, I passed the old company building downtown and barely recognized it. Different logo. Different executives. Different future. I stood there for a moment, then kept walking without stopping. Because in the end, losing the company didn't destroy my family. The choices they made long before the investigation did that. The SEC only exposed what was already broken. And as I disappeared into the crowd, I realized something that finally felt heavier than anger and lighter than grief at the same time. They didn't lose their business first. They lost the one person who spent years trying to save it quietly.